Welcome back. Today will be a bit different, as I will kind of live comment on the situation with Evergrande, with the help of articles and other sites and whatnot. So recently the media and news channels have been full of stories and articles about Evergrande, with stories like this will cause the next crisis, collapse of in-depth developer China Evergrand group could cause a global disaster. We see here in another article, we see is Evergrande the next Lehman Brothers? And all these articles that are kind of spreading, a bit of panic. Okay, so before I go into this, I don't know about you guys, but personally I had never heard about Evergrande. At first I thought people were overreacting and it was probably nothing to worry about. Well, it turns out this company is huge, like huge. So what kind of company is Evergrande? If we look at the group profile, we see the following description. With multi-industry and digital technology, Evergrand Group is a Fortune Global 500 enterprise and owns 8 major industries, such as Evergrand Real Estate, well, of course, that is the biggest part, right, the real estate. Evergrand New Energy Auto, which is basically the automobile industry. We have the Evergrand Property Services, well, of course, that's property or real estate. Then we have Hang Ten Networks, which I searched this up, and this company is an internet service company. Then we have FCB, which is, I'm sorry for my interpretation, it's called Fang Chibao, and it's basically an online real estate and automobile marketplace. So we also see Evergrand Fairyland. Well, what is this? Well, it's basically a theme park, so they're also in theme parks. Then we have Evergrand Health, which is, well, of course, with the health industry. Evergrand Spring, and this is actually a mineral water industry. So basically they are in everything. They are in every industry. Evergrande actually has 200,000 employees and ranks 122nd on the Fortune Global 500 list. And this is basically, the Fortune 500 is basically the 500 biggest companies in the entire world. So this indicates that this is a huge company. I've read on multiple news articles and on multiple sites that Evergrande's debt is around $300 billion at the moment and makes up 2% of China's GDP. So is this really true? Let's find out. Now, Evergrande has not really stated their annual reports or their interim reports of 2021. You can see it reaches till 2020, but we can calculate this, of course, ourselves. So let's look at investing.com. And we can see that the total liabilities is this number, but of course this is in Chinese yuan or renminbi. Let's look at another site to see if this really is, an accurate number. The Wall Street Journal also reports, around the same number. This is, if we calculate this back to dollars, this is around 310 or 320 billion dollars. The GDP of China is, according to Trading Economics, 14.72 trillion. And if we then calculate this, if we divide this, we indeed get around 2%, a bit more. Now, the question is this of significance? Well, we can compare it to Apple. Same quarter till the end of June of this year, we see $265 billion in liability. If we then look at US GDP, we see 20.94 trillion. And this makes a share of GDP of 1.26%. So this really indicates how big Evergrande really is and how much is on the line. Also consider the fact that Apple sells phones and iPads and whatnot. Evergrande especially owns real estate and other properties, which is much more important for people's daily lives. Now let's look at some recent articles about Evergrande. Let's start with Quartz. Evergrande by the digits. So like we said before, they have a debt of $300 billion or 2 trillion yuan, $120 million in interest payments due to bondholders on Thursday. I will talk about this in a second. And then we have some interesting numbers over here. 29% is the share of real estate and related industries as a percentage of Chinese GDP. And also here we have 40%, which is the share of property in Chinese household assets according to HSBC. The average Chinese urban household owns 1.5 residential properties, and urban home ownership is the highest in the world. So these two numbers really show that real estate is a big part of the Chinese economy. And this is also a really interesting number. 75% is the haircut Evergrand bondholders are likely to take. So imagine you have a bond of nominal value $1,000. Then basically you would only receive $250 on that particular bond. So this is a massive loss for the bondholders. And then we see, of course, well, we know what happened to the Evergrand share price, right? It tanked 84% year to date, and I think it actually decreased even more by now. Let's now swiftly move on to Christine Lagarde. She is the head of the ECB. Lagarde said the ECB was keeping tabs on the Chinese property developer. We are looking at it, she said. We are monitoring, and I had a briefing early on today because I think that all financial markets are interconnected. So let's look further into this article. When asked whether the ECB was prepared for the prospect of a chaotic global knock-on effect in the event of Evergrand's collapse, Lagarde replied, "As I told you, for the moment, what we are seeing is a China-centric impact and exposure. I can't speak for the United States, but I can say for Europe that its direct exposure is limited." Alright, so let's see what Jerome Powell of the United States has to say.
In terms of the implications for us, there's not a lot of direct United States exposure. The big Chinese banks are not tremendously exposed, but that you would worry that it would affect global financial conditions through confidence channels and that kind of thing. But I wouldn't draw a parallel to the United States corporate sector.
Of course, it makes sense that these people would say, well, there's nothing wrong, and it's all based in China. We don't have any connection with it. Right, it's because they're central bankers. But let's also look at Ray Dalio, and he's actually an investor and a hedge fund manager. And let's see what he has to say about this.
$300 billion is what they owe, and this is all manageable. The basic economics is, for all countries, in all time, is that if your debt is in your own currency, you can deal with it.
You can work it out.
You could work it out. We've
Right.
seen it happen over and over again. And it's a good thing that lenders get stung, or that the borrowers get stung.
Okay.
That's how the system works.
All right, so all these people basically say that it's contained and there's nothing really to worry about, it's all in China. Well, let's do some own research and find out for ourselves who is really dependent on this company and connected to it. The top mutual fund holders with regards to shares it's quite diversified. We do see a lot of Western funds here, and if they didn't sell their shares by now, well, their positions got absolutely destroyed. However, 85% of the shares, as we can see here, are held by insiders. So it's not actually too interconnected. It's not that bad. In addition, in the news recently, banks like UBS, HSBC and Credit Suisse have actually cut their exposure to Evergrande. Let's also look at who Evergrande owes money. In this article, which is basically stated money stuff, Evergrande borrowed from everyone, we see number one, it owes 1.6 million apartments to people who have put down cash deposits, and it may have trouble delivering them. And number two, it owes billions of dollars in cash to people who have bought wealth management products, so basically retail debt instruments, and it will have trouble paying them, to the point that it has offered to give them apartments instead of money. And here it actually says, it seems to me that what is interesting about Evergrande is not so much the magnitude of its debt problems, but their variety. Evergrande owes money to Chinese banks, it owes money to foreign hedge funds, and foreign investors own its stock, like we saw. It owes money to suppliers and to Chinese retail investors in those wealth management products, and it owes apartments to buyers. And the retail investors who bought Evergrande wealth management products were often also Evergrande homeowners because the products were sold at Evergrande buildings. So, all in all, this is quite worrying, but do we also see this in the financial statements of the company? Well, the quick answer is not really. If we look at investing.com again, we see that China Evergrande Group revenues decreased 16%. Revenues reflect a decrease in demand for the company's products and services due to unfavorable market conditions. So let's look at the balance sheet. We actually have some numbers already calculated here. So we see here the current ratio, which is basically if you can pay off your current assets with your current liabilities, which, well, until this point, so this is around the 30th of June, well, they actually could, right? They had a current ratio of 1.24. But we do see that the long-term debt to equity and the total debt to equity is quite high. Well, it's actually really high, right? It's 300% here. But all in all, and I've looked at the balance sheet and I looked at the income statement and whatnot, but to me, it doesn't really look that worrying the way it is, well, currently expressed in the media. So I do think that this was really due to the last few months or last few weeks. And at last, I would like to discuss this article of the New York Times. And basically, it is how would Evergrand's failure affect China's economy? Now, it says a campaign by the central bank to tame property debt and reduce the banking sector's exposure to troubled developers should mean that an Evergrand failure would have less of an impact on China's financial system. The reality, though, may be more complicated. Panic from investors and homebuyers could spill over into the property market and hit prices, affecting household wealth and confidence. It could also shake global financial markets and make it harder for other Chinese companies to continue to finance their businesses with foreign investment. And this is actually really important, because if Evergrand indeed has to sell off its assets, then there will be a huge oversupply of real estate and property. And basically, if there's such a big oversupply, it would completely crash the Chinese real estate market. Now, of course, this would affect household wealth, but it would also affect confidence. And maybe, right, maybe the Western world is not really that directly involved with the Chinese market or with the Chinese real estate market, but indirectly it could have a huge effect because of confidence. Right, we could have a confidence crisis, because who says that if this happens in China, it couldn't happen in the West? And this is also in line with this last part. So I think that everyone basically already knows now that Evergrande is a problem and that they have too much debt. So I think other companies that are trying to invest in China, or I think a lot of people are scared to invest in these companies, and this will make financing a lot harder for these companies. So let's move on to the last article, which is about the global bondholders that didn't receive interest payment according to this article. So if you didn't know, this Thursday, Evergrand had to make an interest payment of $83 million. And actually next week they have to make another one. And somewhere I read that they have closed a deal with the bondholders to pay a part of the interest this Thursday. But here it actually says that they didn't receive interest payment. So I'm not quite sure if they received it or not, but in general, I tried to find this on the internet, but it's really quiet regarding this event. I couldn't really find a lot about it. But it's actually a really important event. Why? Because if they don't pay the interest payments to the bondholders, then the company basically goes into default if this happens more frequently. Now, with regards to the bailout, yes, there have been multiple bailouts in the past, like 3 Chinese banks in the summer of 2019. But I think President Xi is not going to bail them out this time. And I think this is also in line with his view on a more equal society. President Xi once said, "Houses are for living in, not speculating." Now, if they let them fail, which is highly probable, they will probably let it fail in a controlled manner where possible. If they would let them abruptly fail in combination with a systemic risk in the banking and real estate sector, it would cause a complete collapse in China, and it could also have a big effect globally. But the people in charge of Evergrand, of course, at least have to be fired, and there will be probably more consequences. If this event will go unpunished, it will create a moral hazard with big Chinese companies. You see, if other big corporations know that they will get bailed out anyway, just like Evergrand, they will take more risk, loan more money, and be less careful. And this is just not what you want, as this creates high leverage, more debt, and especially more malinvestments. I guess if the company collapses and we look back at it in a few years, you could say the company was Evergrand. Please let me know what you think about Evergrand and the possible consequences it will have. Thanks for listening. I will see you in the next video.